If you want to understand Russia, start with one uncomfortable idea. In Russia, you are not a citizen. You are an asset. A unit. The state can move, tax, draft, silence, and, when needed, strip for parts. Money, labor, loyalty, bodies, whatever the system is short on this year. And that's why Russia can look patriotic on television while ordinary life feels like a permanent shakedown. Because the Russian state does not behave like a modern government that serves a public. It behaves like an internal empire, one that learned to colonize inward. Not only neighbors and conquered territories, but its own population. If that sounds harsh, watch the pattern. When the treasury is strained, the measuring stick changes. When the system needs control, rights become optional. When it needs resources fast, it calls extraction, necessity, security, or patriotism. I'm Elvira Bary, a writer born in the Soviet Union. Today, I'll show you the coherent logic behind Russia's internal extraction machine, how the gate is built, how money gets quietly confiscated, how default becomes policy, and why this circle keeps repeating across centuries. Here's our roadmap for today. The Bottleneck Gate, how the state sits on the choke points of the economy. Money without mercy. How changing the value of money becomes extraction. Default as policy, when the state simply declares obligations don't exist. Soviet extraction, coercion labeled voluntary. Shock therapy for the people, reforms that erase savings and repeat the playbook. Why nothing changes. Why the same pattern returns under new flags. If you want to keep this kind of analysis independent, you can support the channel through think tank membership, PayPal, Super Thanks, or Hype Points. And if you are listening on Spotify, hit follow so new episodes land in your feed. Now, let's start with the main tool of internal colonialism, the gate. The Bottleneck Gate. If Russia practices a form of internal colonialism, then the bottleneck economy is its main instrument of extraction. In classic empires, colonized territories had to pass through the imperial port. Their goods, labor, and wealth flowed through a controlled gate before reaching global markets. The metropole owned the harbor. In Russia's case, the harbor is domestic. A bottleneck economy means you can trade, invest, expand, or become truly wealthy without passing through a gate, and the state owns that gate. In that kind of system, private success is never fully private. You can work hard, you can innovate, you can even own property on paper, but the only path to serious capital runs through state contracts, state approvals, state financing, and state tolerance. The gate decides. If I rule such a system, I don't need to be efficient. I don't even need to be competent in the modern managerial sense. I need control. Once I sit on the choke points, energy exports, credit allocation, licenses, courts, access to foreign currency, dysfunction becomes an asset. Scarcity is not a failure, it is leverage. People want something badly enough: access, protection, a permit, a government contract, a favorable court ruling. I control the gateway, I decide who passes, and I charge a premium. Not always in money, but in loyalty. The tighter the bottleneck, the more valuable my favor becomes. That is how internal colonialism operates. The population is not merely taxed. It is filtered. Opportunities are rationed. Advancement is conditional. Autonomy is provisional. So people compete to be among the chosen. They adapt and signal obedience. They defend the regime that keeps them dependent because standing close to the gate feels safer than standing outside it. And if the rules stop serving me, I don't reform the structure. I rewrite the rules mid-game and call it a necessary measure for stability, for sovereignty, and for national security. In a bottleneck state, unpredictability is not chaos, it is policy. Now, step inside the system. If I'm a mid-level official in this structure, I quickly learn something corrosive. The state sees me as a function, not as a citizen. I can be dismissed, persecuted, or sacrificed at any moment. There are no stable protections, only shifting political winds. So I take what I can while I can. Corruption stops being a moral deviation. It becomes survival arithmetic. And this is why absolute power produces two opposite results at once. At the top, incompetence, because the ruler does not want feedback. He wants affirmation. Loyal subordinates tell him what he prefers to hear. The smartest people either fall silent or exit the country. Below, frantic extraction, because everyone understands the state has no enduring obligation toward them, so they mirror its behavior. If the system extracts from me, I will extract from someone weaker. That is how a colonial mindset internalizes itself. Zoom out and look at the emotional outcome. In a bottleneck economy, society does not build durable institutions. It builds coping strategies. People do not say, let's fix the rules. They say, let's find a workaround. They do not rely on contracts. They rely on connections. They do not trust courts. They look for patron. And when the state confiscates something, savings, wages, pensions, purchasing power, many do not rebel. They shrink their expectations. They adjust downward. They call it realism. It is often a trauma response disguised as wisdom. This is the part many Western observers miss. They look at a specific event. A default, a currency collapse, a new tax, a sudden nationalization, and ask, how could people tolerate that? But in a bottleneck economy, you are not accepting one event. You are accepting the gate itself. And once you accept the gate, the rest follows. Before we move on, I'd like to introduce a short book trailer for my novel about the rise of Stalinism in Soviet Russia, The Prince of the Soviets.
Find out who he really is.
Officially, Klim Rogov's biography read like something safe and respectable. A journalist from New York, a foreign correspondent working for a prestigious news agency. In reality, Klim Rogov was a white emigre. And if that truth were ever exposed, he would be arrested on the spot.
Very interesting.
He came to the Soviet Union for one reason only, to find his wife abducted by the Bolsheviks. And he did find her, just not where he expected. It turned out she had caught the attention of the only red millionaire in the entire country, a man inexplicably allowed to run a private business in a state supposedly devoted to building socialism. A man powerful enough to break the rules in Stalin's Moscow.
Will you catch him?
We'll catch them all.
Money without mercy. When the state controls the money, it can extract wealth in a way that looks like administration. No soldiers at your door, no confiscation squads, just a decree. Let's go back to the mid-1600s. Russia is fighting a long and expensive war with the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Wars eat silver. The treasury is strained. The ruler needs liquidity, fast. Under Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich, the government makes a decision that sounds technical, but lands like a punch. Issue large quantities of copper coins and require everyone to accept them at the same face value as silver. On paper, it is elegant. 1 ruble equals 1 ruble. Metal is irrelevant. In reality, metal is everything. Silver has intrinsic value. Copper does not hold the same trust. Once copper floods the market, the logic of the decree collapses against human behavior. Prices rise. People hoard silver. Merchants demand more coins for the same goods. Counterfeiting spreads. Grain disappears from city markets as peasants refuse to exchange real food for depreciating money. This is not abstract economics, it is daily survival. The state has not physically reached into anyone's purse, yet purchasing power evaporates. Wealth shifts silently toward the issuer of the new money. The experiment detonates socially in 1662. In what becomes known as the Copper Riot in Moscow, a large uprising fueled by monetary chaos, wartime pressure, and rising taxation. The rebellion is suppressed. The lesson remains. And it is not an isolated maneuver. In the same century, the state also reduced the silver content of coins while keeping their nominal value unchanged, a quieter form of extraction known across early modern Europe. Debasement was not uniquely Russian, but in Russia it becomes part of the recurring governing instinct. When strained, adjust the measuring stick. The pattern repeats. Under Catherine II, in the late 18th century, the empire introduces its first large-scale paper currency. In 1768, assignation banks are established, and paper assignation rubles enter circulation. The argument is practical and modern. Paper is lighter than metal. It facilitates trade. It helps finance war and administration more flexibly. At first, it works. The supply expands dramatically. Historical estimates show assignats in circulation rising from modest early levels to around 100 million rubles by 1786 and roughly 212.7 million by the beginning of the 19th century. The paper ruble begins to drift against silver. There is no single spectacular collapse. That is what makes it effective. The ruler does not declare, "We are confiscating your savings." Instead, the yardstick bends gradually. If you are paid in paper while market prices implicitly track silver, your salary shrinks without any formal decree reducing it. This is internal colonial logic applied to money. The colony does not decide the currency. The metropole does. The population absorbs the loss. The center absorbs the gain. Default as policy. By the early 20th century, Russia is already a state trained in emergency reflexes. Borrow heavily, centralize control, postpone consequences. Then World War I arrives. On July 27, 1914, the Russian State Bank suspends specie payments. In plain language, you can no longer demand gold or silver in exchange for paper rubles. The metal backing still exists on paper, but not in your hand. War tears open the budget. Mobilization is expensive. Imports are disrupted. Revenues shrink. And in a particular self-inflicted blow, the government suspends the state vodka monopoly at the start of the war, one of its most reliable sources of income. A major revenue stream vanishes overnight. By the way, I have a video explaining how vodka was one of Russia's most important sources of revenue. The response is predictable. Prices rise, goods disappear, wages lag behind reality. Public anger accumulates. Monetary strain becomes political strain. By 1917, the regime itself collapses under the weight of war, shortages, and mistrust. But the most radical monetary lesson is still ahead. In February 1918, the Bolshevik government issues a decree annulling all state loans, domestic and foreign. At the time, foreign loans alone amount to roughly 12.5 billion rubles in gold terms, an enormous sum by contemporary standards. Domestic obligations are even larger. The exact modern equivalent is debated by historians, but the scale was catastrophic for investors. With one legal act, the state deletes its debt and therefore deletes other people's assets. This is not just a story about foreign financiers. French investors in particular had widely purchased Russian bonds, encouraged by years of official assurances and diplomatic goodwill. Russian bonds were marketed as solid, respectable imperial securities. They sat in middle-class portfolios in Paris, Brussels, and London, treated as safe instruments of a rising modern power. And inside Russia, countless citizens had bought domestic war bonds as patriotic investments. Then, one decree reduces them to paper. This is internal colonialism in its most naked form. Soviet extraction. By the Soviet period, the scam becomes a routine. The state wants the same thing it always wants in a bottleneck economy: accumulate resources fast. And it has a perfect tool. It can call coercion participation. One of the cleanest examples is state bonds and loans sold to the population. On paper, it's citizens investing in the future. In real life, it's pressure at your workplace and the quiet understanding that refusing is dangerous. You had to spend at least 20 to 25% of your annual income on those bonds, and the state could reduce their yield from 8% to 3% overnight and postpone the start of payments for 20 years, as it did in 1936. Now add hunger. In the early 1930s, people were desperate enough to trade the last thing that connected them to a normal life: wedding rings, earrings, family icons with silver covers, anything of value. That's where Torgsin comes in. Officially, it was a retail system. In practice, it was a pump that pulled gold and foreign currency out of the population in exchange for food and basic goods. One widely cited figure is 287 million gold rubles brought to the state through Torgsin's operations. That amount was 10 times what the Bolsheviks got out of selling abroad their precious collection of the Hermitage Museum. It paid the imported equipment for 10 major industrial plants. The 1947 monetary reform is the classic. Cash in people's hands was exchanged at 10 old rubles to 1 new ruble, and the exchange window was brutally short, about 1 week. The state even framed it as a moral cleansing. We are fighting speculation, we are correcting distortions. This is necessary. But for a normal family with a little cash at home, it felt like punishment for surviving. Then comes the part that sounds like a dark joke, but isn't. In 1957, Khrushchev's move to stop the annual bond drives and suspend payments due on earlier bonds for 20 to 25 years. That's the bottleneck economy speaking in its most honest voice. Your savings will stay in your hands as a symbol. And in 1961, another technical reform arrives. A 10-to-1 redenomination sold as a tidy cleanup. But the ruble's official relationship to the dollar and gold content shifted by about 4.44 times, not 10. The prices in Soviet stores and markets weren't reduced 10 times either, only about 5. People still received the same wages, but now they could only afford a half of what they used to buy before. It was actually shrinkflation. Shock therapy for the people. When the USSR started wobbling, it reached for old muscle memory. In January 1991, the government pulled the Pavlov reform. Large denomination bills, 50 and 100 rubles, were yanked out of circulation with a very tight window to exchange them, and limits on how much you could swap. The official goal was to fight the shadow economy and inflation, but the lived result was panic, lines for basic goods, and the feeling that the state was hunting your cash. Even when the state claims it's fighting criminals, it still punishes everyone because that's what colonial power does. Next, the savings. Most Soviet families used state savings deposits as the only available option to save up some money for a rainy day. With consumer credit basically absent, people saved for years for a car, an apartment, cooperative payment, furniture, a wedding, a child's education, or just the quiet dignity of living through older age without begging relatives. By the end of the USSR, household savings sitting in state saving deposits were about 500 billion rubles. Then the country cracked. Prices were freed, inflation tore through everyday life. Those saved up rubles didn't get stolen with one theatrical decree. They just stopped meaning anything. Because of hyperinflation, 1 million of those old rubles now amounted to about 1,000 new ones. You couldn't buy much on that. The state had used those deposits to finance itself for decades. Later, it launched compensation programs, but those never got even remotely close to matching what the savings had represented in real purchasing power. In the late 1990s, Russia replayed another old move, default. On August 17, 1998, the Russian government devalued the ruble, defaulted on domestic debt, and declared a moratorium on certain foreign payments. That's the modern version of the measuring stick is changing. It wipes out trust in savings, wages, and promises, and it teaches a new generation the same old lesson. And here's what's almost funny if it wasn't so grim. After every shock, the state can point to circumstances, war, sanctions, enemies, speculators, saboteurs. Some of those factors can be real, but the system's instinct is still the same. Protect the gatekeeper and dump the loss downward on regular people. Why nothing changes? So why doesn't this cycle break? Because the bottleneck economy produces the exact culture that preserves it. At the top, a ruler surrounded by loyalists starts believing loyalty equals competence. Bad decisions don't get punished quickly because there are no rivals who can call them out. The leader does not learn from his mistakes. Instead, he doubles down on them. At the bottom, everyone learns that rules are a performance. If the state keeps lying to you, you lie back. You stop investing in public trust and create private escape routes. Cash under the mattress, favors, family networks, side hustles, and moving money abroad if you can. And that's the trap. Each individual move is rational. The collective result is a society that can't build a durable we. So when someone asks me, will Russia default again? My answer is, why wouldn't it, if the gate stays in the same hands? Now, I want to ask you something personal and practical. If you woke up tomorrow and realized the state was quietly taking your savings, not with soldiers, but with technical measures like currency changes, sudden limits, or forced conversion, what would be your first move? Would you pull cash? Buy hard assets? Move money abroad? Panic buy essentials? Or would you assume it's temporary and wait? Tell me what you do and why. I read the comments and your answers shape what I cover next. If this episode helped you see the mechanism clearly, please like the video and subscribe. Share it with one person who still thinks Russia is just mysterious, not engineered. And if you want to support this work directly, you can join my think tank or use PayPal or Super Thanks. You can also tap hype points to help the video travel. And for those listening on Spotify, hit follow so you don't miss the next episode. Thank you for watching. See you the next time.